I've got a few different areas I'm going to be comparing the two on. This car, my blue 9.3 right here, is sitting on lowering springs, and my black Turbo X right here, that is sitting on coilovers. But before I get into this video, I figure I'll do a cold start between the two, and I'm gonna put a poll up in the corner. Tell me which one you guys think sounds better. I mean, I don't want to say which one I like more, but it's pretty obvious which one sounds better in my opinion. So actually, there is one more thing I want to mention before I get to what I want to talk about today, and that is that if you are going to Saab Owners Convention, and if you don't know what I'm talking about, check the link up here in the top corner where you can learn more about the event. But if you are going and you want to have your car featured on the channel, I'm going to be, of course, filming while I'm there. So please feel free to DM me on Instagram. That's the best way to reach me. Or if you don't have Instagram, you can also email me and we can figure out something so that way you can get your car on the channel, because I want to feature as many of your guys' cars as I can. So coilovers versus lowering springs. These are two of the probably most popular options outside of air suspension for aftermarket suspension on your car. So these cars are both on the same chassis, although they look quite different, one being all-wheel drive, one being front-wheel drive. But they have very similar suspensions from factory, we'll say, even though, of course, they're not the same from factory. They were very similar. And now, of course, they both have aftermarket options on them. So let me just start off by saying, if you're doing a budget build, and on your car, you're not trying to spend a ton of money on it, you're just trying to make it look good for cheap, then I'm gonna go ahead and tell you that the best option for suspension on your car is going to be lowering springs. When I got the lowering springs on this car, which were eBay lowering springs, surprisingly, they were like $80. I'll put a link to the video where I installed them up here in the top corner. But when I got the lowering springs for this car, it lowered the car like an inch and a half, which was honestly all that I needed, and I think it looks pretty good with where it sits right now. Of course, the car is filthy because I parked next to a sprinkler last night, so you know, hard water did its thing, so that's great. But honestly, it gave the car a more aggressive ride height, even though it still looks like a monster truck compared to the Turbo X, which really in reality isn't even that low. Price, definitely the advantage goes to lowering springs because you're just replacing the springs. You're not replacing the entire assembly like you are with coilovers. So a good set of coilovers, this car has map tune coilovers on it, which were on it when I bought the car. But a good set of coilovers, especially for your Saab, is probably gonna cost you somewhere around $800 to $1,000. So they're much more expensive than lowering springs. I mean, you can get, those were just eBay lowering springs, which for me have been good. But if you want a good set of lowering springs, you're probably gonna pay somewhere between $100 and $200. So this brings me to my next point of adjustability. With lowering springs, they're just springs. So you just put them on the car. You can't adjust anything. Wherever it sits, that's where it sits. You can't adjust how stiff they are, whatever. But with coilovers, the big advantage with coilovers is you can adjust the ride height, you can adjust how stiff they ride, you can adjust a whole variety of things. Of course, some coilovers offer more adjustability than others, but you have that adjustability option. So theoretically, if I wanted to raise the ride height of my Turbo X like 2 inches right now, I could just jack it up, use a little tool to change the ride height, and probably in a couple hours the car could be back up around where stock ride height is. Not something I would ever do, because who the hell would do that? But I could, theoretically. And of course it has this little knob right here for other adjustments as well on both sides. For the front coilovers at least, not so much for the rear. So having that adjustability is nice, because let's say you get a good set of coilovers and you're like, man, these really ride rough. I mean, generally these two aftermarket options are going to ride harsher than your stock suspension, because you know it's made more for performance generally. But to an extent you can adjust the comfort settings on coilovers, and again you can adjust any sort of settings at all with lowering springs. So that leads me to my next point of comfort, which again, it really depends on the coilovers and springs. So I know there are some lowering springs out there, and maybe not necessarily even lowering springs, but aftermarket springs where the ride is meant to be more comfortable than the OEM ride. But if you're looking for performance lowering springs, you're probably not going to get anything that's more comfortable than OEM. So I should just state right now that both of these cars do not ride as comfortably as they did from factory. This one rides slightly harsher with the lowering springs. You can, of course, feel more little bumps and divots and stuff in the road. And with these, I mean, just because it's set so low, it's also set stiff, so that way I don't slam the frame on the ground when I go over a dip or something. So it's set more stiff on purpose, which it's not the most comfortable, but it's also, it doesn't ride rough at all. It still rides smooth, in my opinion. So if you want something more harsh, if you're taking your car to the track, you can of course make them stiffer, reduce body roll. But I'm just gonna say, in terms of performance and handling, which is my next point, that while both of these cars handle better than they did with stock suspension, of course I can't compare that on the Turbo X, but I know that comparing it with just to the lowering springs alone, that they both handle better with their aftermarket suspension than they did with their stock suspension. Like, let's say I'm gonna take the same gradual right-hand turn. There's one semi-close to where I live that I can usually, if I'm pushing the car, I can take it around 50 and really feel it grip, and you know, it's just that fun feeling. I don't know how else to describe it. But if I were to take it at the same speed in both cars, I'm still gonna feel not a significant amount of body roll, but I'm still gonna really feel that body roll with just the lowering springs. Now on the coilovers, this thing honestly handles just as well, if not better, going around corners than my Miata did, my first generation Miata. And I think that's saying a lot. Of course that Miata still had a ton of body roll because it was on stock suspension, but this thing has almost zero body roll that I can tell. I mean, it's incredible how well coilovers transform your car when you're taking a turn. I have to give the edge to coilovers because they just handle better. I mean, if you're gonna track your car, you're not gonna buy lowering springs. I mean, it's gonna help a little bit, but if you really want to see a difference with performance, you gotta spend the extra money and get coilovers. So just for a comparison between ride heights here, over here on the Turbo X with coilovers, I can't get one finger in straight like that, but I can get it in there up at an angle, which is pretty tight. Wink. And then with the arc over here, I can get 2 fingers in fairly straight. So it sits higher, of course that makes it a lot easier to drive around when there's divots and potholes and stuff. But I still think this car looks way better. And of course, if I wanted to raise this car up to the same height as the Arc, I could. But if I wanted to lower this car to the same height as a Turbo X, I couldn't. Like I mentioned at the beginning, if you're trying to do this on a budget and you really don't have all the money in the world, just go with lowering springs. It's gonna provide some improvement, but it's not gonna completely change the car. Now, if you have the money, and especially if you're going to be tracking your car or driving it hard through turns and you really want to feel that grip, you definitely have to go with coilovers. In my opinion, they are worth the money. So if you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a big thumbs up. Again, if you are going to SOC or if you hope to make it to SOC, please DM me on Instagram or email me so that way I can get one of your cars on the channel, because again, I really want to share your cars off to everyone else that watches. So thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you next time.